So I've looked over your VOD, and instead of going over a bunch of micro things, I'm just going to talk about two things that you really need to focus on. The first thing is going to be spacing, and the other one's more to do with your damage potential. Yeah, so spacing, more important. People talk about positioning quite a lot, and it's not really that helpful because it's not really relatable to anything. So, it's better to think about spacing. It makes things a lot easier to figure out. So all heroes have this sort of preferred spacing, the distance from front line, distance from enemy team, and also, distance from certain heroes on their own team too. And in this VOD, you started almost every fight with quite sort of weak spacing, which made things really difficult for you. Batiste's ideal spacing is in this sort of close to mid-range, close enough to your team to hit easy heals and frontline damage, but also sort of far back enough to avoid that trash damage coming through main. It's even more important versus dive, as, you have to be spread out from your front line so that you don't get caught by an engage, but also because most of the enemy team is flanking, so you need to be far back enough to actually get info on that flank and have LOS. Okay, so if we look at this fight here, this is pretty much how all of your fights ended up. You're really clumped up with your front line on cart, and then when the engage comes in, you get caught in it, and you just have to focus on staying alive. This is a really sort of inefficient way of playing Baptiste. It's especially bad because you're playing into dive, right? You should realize that, like, hey, I'm playing into dive. They're probably not gonna try to engage your Orisa Hog, and if they do, I can still heal them from range, right? You don't need to be in this Orisa's hitbox to hit her with a mouse too. So there's really no real advantage to playing so close to the tanks in the first place. But there's a lot of disadvantage. There's a lot of disadvantages, right? First of all, you're taking a lot of pressure, but also it means that your LOS is so bad. You had absolutely no idea like who was coming for this dive, when they were coming in. You didn't know like where your backline was, whether they were going to need healing, and we can see because you're so far up and you didn't have LOS, by the time you realize that this Ashe needs healing, it's just way too late. We can imagine if you're playing back here, maybe not back here actually, maybe in the if you sort of flanked a bit and gone in the doorway to the right by the mega, maybe that's better. I mean, there's no real perfect position, when you're going to get engaged on by a dive. This is again why we talk about spacing a bit more, because like spacing generally is just a lot more important. But we can imagine if you're playing further back, you'd actually be able to like peel, for those heroes. And pretty much every fight this game, sort of ends up in this way where like as soon as the fight starts, you get engaged on, you focus on staying alive, and you're always on this sort of back foot where like sure, like you're healing your team, you're doing stuff, but you're always like trying to like fight to stay afloat. And it's difficult to talk about like your micro stuff, how you use your abilities, who you focus, when you spend so much of your time just trying to stay alive. Yeah, so your spacing screwed you a little bit versus dive, but the enemy team swaps Orisa, so spacing stuff isn't really as important. And this is where the damage stuff comes in a little bit more, because you seem to be in this mindset, this game, where you're focusing really hard on healing your team. And like, sure, you can say like, oh, my team needed healing a lot of the time, and yeah, they did. But you can think like, why is my team taking so much damage? And they're taking so much damage because heroes on the enemy team, like the Winston, the Genji, the Hanzo, they're allowed to flank and set up and do whatever they want. And like your team's really not sort of putting out enough range pressure to stop them from doing that. And you can say like, oh, that's my DPS's job. They're meant to be contesting these heroes, but you really can't disrespect like your responsibility as Baptiste to do that. You're focusing very, very hard on these heals, and you can do a lot more damage. And like this example here is pretty bad. Like your team gets antied. Go back a little bit. Like your team gets antied, which means they can't even get healing, right? They can't even get healed for 5 seconds. And you'd rather turn around and look at them and wait for the anti to go off than to like sort of look for damage options. And it's just a sign of this like mindset you're in that's really screwing you. And this situation is like so much worse when you realize you're playing a Moira on this defense. You're playing Moira like in Orisa, versus Orisa, which means that like pretty much the only thing she can do is heal these people behind barriers, right? There's not really anything else she's going to be able to do. I mean, sure, she'll stay alive when Genji dashes in, but that's about it. And what this does really is gives you like a free path to almost ignore your team and focus like solely on going for these damage options, and stopping these Genjis, these Hanzos from like doing whatever they want. And it's not like you have to go and duel these people and kill them. It's just small stuff like Hanzo's not going to feel as free peeking a corner, if someone's shooting at him. If you can force out like a deflect from Genji maybe before he goes in, he's going to find it so much more difficult. It's just this sort of like unwillingness to like look for these damage options that really hurts you, because your team, they're in they were in the situation in a lot of this game where you're sort of stuck on the back foot. You know, like the enemy's coming in, everyone's taking so much damage, and you're fighting really hard to keep them alive, but it's sort of a fruitless task, right? Because like the fight was lost like when those heroes were allowed to sort of do so much damage to you and collapse on you and stuff. And like you spend, after you swapped with Amora, you spend so much of this game just sort of like overlapping your heal potential, right? Like both of you are just holding mass one into, oh, she's holding mass one, you're holding mass two, like into an Orisa. And just no one's putting out enough damage to like stop these DPS heroes from like having free reign over your team. Actually did like make a video recently about like understanding this like division of labor in supports that was like quite a lot inspired by the defense of this VOD. So maybe check that out. Okay, so quick example here of how you're not really focusing on damage again. Enemy team pops out high ground, pop out the Orisa shield, and you just focus on healing frontline here. Yeah, again, you have this Moira who's doing it for you anyway, and I think you let maybe like one burst into the shield after it comes out. Not even like I don't know. You have a massive responsibility to put on not just damage pressure, but also shield pressure, really importantly, and you don't perform that at all here. And it's like it's again this just sort of this mindset of only focusing on heals on healing that's really screwing your team. Like sure, like you might keep these tanks alive for like far longer than they should be alive, but it's you're losing fights because you're focusing so much on the heals, especially in a situation like this where you already have someone who's going to be putting out the bulk kills on those tanks. Yeah, so sorry it's a bit different today. Like I didn't really focus on specific things you did, more just like your general like technique of playing Baptiste. But if you focus on those two things, spacing apart from your team so that you're not getting caught by engages and that you actually have LOS, as well as actually putting out some damage pressure so that the enemy team can't sort of get on you for free, you should hopefully be able to sort of avoid these situations where your team's always getting overwhelmed and you're always on the back foot.